You're with Jon Faine on ABC Radio Melbourne. Call 1300 222 774 or text 0437 774 774.
25 minutes to 9. John Howard was out on the campaign trail with Tony Abbott in a shopping centre yesterday in suburban Sydney. Interestingly, former Prime Minister Paul Keating is out and about this morning and is in my studio this morning for his commentary, his observations and undoubtedly also his support for the Labor campaign as it gets to the pointy end of election 2019. Paul Keating, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, John. Nice to be here.
John Howard yesterday said that he detects in the community a lot of growing suspicion that Bill Shorten is after your savings. They don't want it taken away through taxes, and small business, he says, effectively is not the big end of town, as Mr. Shorten keeps saying.
Just a bit of nonsense. Bill Shorten not taking away people's income through taxes. What he's doing is reducing uncalled for tax expenditures. There's abuse of the tax system introduced by John Howard. The dividend imputation gift. The unsustainable freebie for superannuation, which the current government itself has already changed. I mean, there's a difference between taxing people and not giving tax expenditures that should never have been given in the first place. Howard will say anything at any time to support any argument.
But he's not wrong if he's saying, and according to the reaction they got as they walked around the shopping centre, people are saying, well, I'm losing something under these changes that the Labor Party are proposing, and I'm not the top end of town.
I'd be very surprised if, let's call it, the ordinary shopper is not only losing anything, but getting something from the Labor Party. They're getting a tax cut, which was promoted by the Labor Party and now matched by the current government down the bottom end of the tax system. So for most people out there, except for people who have the benefit of, let's say, imputation credits or who have got 5 or 6 properties and have some cost in the future, not currently, because all properties currently under Labor policy are grandfathered. So if you own 4 properties and you have negative gearing, that's protected. You can keep that. You just can't keep it up. You can't start a new one. That's it, yeah.
So I think I hope that's widely understood. But what John Howard is very good at, as are you, and it's interesting that it's the two...
Well, I'll tell you what I'm not into, misinformation.
No, but it's the two old war horses coming out to try and help their tribes. It's a reflection, and a sad reflection, on the calibre of the current leadership.
I don't think so.
On his side, it's John Howard. On your side, it's Paul Keating, who come in at the last minute.
No, I don't. I mean, I just happened to be around, that was all. And you're such an entertaining fellow, I thought I should come in and join your program.
So what we've got at the moment is a campaign that is increasingly presidential. How does Paul Keating see politics in Australia as increasingly presidential? A good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I don't think it is increasingly presidential on the Labor side. At the Labor Party launch, you saw Bill Shorten, but you saw the front bench, what would be the cabinet, sitting beside him. And 16 of those people have already been cabinet ministers. And you know them by sight and by name. Tanya Plibersek, been a minister, Penny Wong, Chris Bowen, Tony Burke. So clearly the Labor Party is not presenting a presidential thing. The Liberal Party is. The reason that Morrison had no front benches on stage for the launch is that there's none you can pull together to turn into a cabinet. The best people have already gone.
Josh Frydenberg was front and centre?
Oh, well, there's got to be 1 or 2 left, but that's about it. But this was, did you see the Labor lineup, how impressive it is? I mean, virtually what Shorten is doing is presenting himself as the chairman of a very competent board, a very competent cabinet, and it would be a competent cabinet. The last time we saw the Labor Party this good, I think, as a cabinet, was really in 1983 with Bob Hawke's first ministry. This is what you're seeing again with Shorten. So Shorten will be the competent leader of a really important and solid team. The Liberal Party has not seen Morrison. I mean, what's amazing about the Liberal Party is they've actually made a virtue of having no strategy. The Liberal Party is out there saying, please elect us. By the way, we don't have any strategy for the country. We don't have any vista for the country. There's no panorama. There's no view about the big shifts in world power. But by the way, our leader is the man next door. He'll jump the fence and do a barbecue for you. He'll pull on the baseball cap. You know, he's the guy next door. Well, thank you. We need more than the guy next door.
Not long ago, you were critical of the Labor Party's tax policies and said they'd lost the ability to speak aspirationally to people and to fashion policies to meet those aspirations. That was Paul Keating just barely 18 months ago.
Well, we've seen a big shift since then. I mean, Labor's now got these important changes in the tax system, but they're keeping the progression in the tax system. A progressive, you know, look at the tax system of a country. It'll tell you a little bit about the country. And that is, this is a progressive tax system where the lowest income people pay the least tax and the highest income people pay the most tax. That Labor Party is proposing at this election. By contrast, what the Liberal Party is proposing is a more flat tax. In other words, as they usually do, try and relieve tax on the people at the top of the system so that the burden sits further down below.
But the proportion of a high-income earner's income that goes to tax is massive, and proportionally, people on high incomes pay the most of the tax system. In fact, a huge part of Australian people, including people on low incomes, pay virtually no tax at all when you look at the offsets and rebates.
If they're on, I mean, where's the tax-free threshold? I can't remember currently, about 18,000 or something, where you pay
18.5, I think it is.
Where you pay no tax, and that's really as it should be. And if you're at the top of the system and you're earning reasonably, you should pay more than your share, your fair share. Yeah, as you'll pay your fair share, that is more than the people at the bottom of the system.
Yes, but if people at the top of the tax tree are paying enormous amounts of tax overall, then the government is offering them relief and saying, well, that stimulates more demand, which is what everyone is saying needs to be done to the economy.
Look, what the Labor Party is proposing for a very modest increase in revenue to GDP, 0.2 or 0.3%, back to the average level of the Howard government, they're talking about an entirely different kind of country. The Labor Party is talking about access and equity in health, access and equity in education, in superannuation, in disabilities, in childcare, in aged care, dental support. In other words, what keeps Australia together as a society, which is, we can see doesn't happen in a country like the United States. What keeps us together as a society is that we are all members of the Australian family. So in health, the health of any one of us should be important to all of us. That's the principle underneath Medicare, for instance. Same with superannuation, same with NDIS. I mean, Labor is proposing a fairer, better, more efficient country with a focus on human capital. I mean, Labor, look, Bob Hawke and I did Australian capital. We revolutionised Australian capital. What Shorten and Bowen are doing is revolutionising, and Tanya Plibersek, they're revolutionising human capital.
But you do want to give people an incentive to go out and work harder and earn more and run businesses. That's what drives the economy, surely.
Yeah, but a reduction in personal taxation is what's happening. There are no proposals by either party to change the corporate rate. And so the incentives are there. But you
the Liberal Party offering for small business is vastly better than the one on offer from the Labor Party.
The poison in societies today is the maldistribution of wealth. The poison in the American political culture is the unfairness of the distribution of income and wealth. Right? Because of the policies of the Labor Party over the years, we've avoided that. The best system of minimum wage rates in the world, access and equity with Medicare, superannuation. We've avoided the terrible American problem. But you have to keep reforming and improving these things. So I mean, look, we're going to be moving into a much more horizontal, collaborative world with the internet and with the digital economy.
There's little evidence of that so far, although people predicted it doesn't seem to happen.
You can just see it. I mean, everyone, for the first time in human history, you and I are connected to everyone else in the world, through that computer.
Yes,
and of course, commerce is going to be there. What we've got to do today is teach kids how to navigate and move through that world.
It's created digital billionaires and digital orphans, people who have been completely left behind.
But look, there's so many. Look at the ones that are coming up that are not digital orphans. Look at these two boys in Sydney worth $10 billion each. You could hardly call them digital orphans.
No, they're the billionaires.
But there's going to be lots of people with good incomes in the digital economy. But it's important that we're able, through education and training, through universities and particularly TAFE, that we teach kids how to swim in and navigate the digital economy in this very collaborative, interconnected world. Now, the Liberal Party has no idea about this. I mean, it's as if the internet hasn't happened, as if the digital economy in the world kind of hasn't happened. And here we are training people for various jobs that they'll never have, jobs that are disappearing. So the reformation in human capital, which the Labor Party is proposing, is years late, but now better late than never.
9:15 on ABC Radio Melbourne. Jon Faine with Paul Keating, who is joining the campaign for the second time in recent weeks. China and the trade war. Before we get there, you made a contribution to understanding the role of Australian security services last week that had you roundly condemned. Do you regret your comments that it's the nutters in charge of Australia's spy services?
I was sort of speaking in code, John, to the foreign policy and security establishment. Of course we need a security apparatus to deal with terrorism and insidious influences. They're in all societies.
So who are the nutters?
And the agencies will do that. But what in shorthand I was suggesting is that, important as it is, security agency intelligence should not be the currency of Australia's foreign policy settings. In other words, the foreign policy of Australia should be made in relation to the tectonic plates of power in the world. That's what we should be making the foreign policy, and not sort of university dormitory chit-chat, which the intelligence agencies pick up in their signals intelligence, and then that goes into the cabinet room informing the foreign policy. I mean, look, the great shift in the world, in the late 19th century, power in the world shifted from Germany and Britain across the Atlantic to the United States. The 20th century was the US century, the United States century. But at the end of the 20th century, power in the world has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's shifted from the United States broadly to China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, etc. It is for the current government as if that tectonic plate has not happened. And when you look at our foreign policy, the absence of a coherent foreign policy to deal with the fact, say, China, which is the largest country in the world by income parity, by purchasing power parity, and will soon be the largest country in the world, full stop.
By economy, you mean?
By economy, by exchange rates. It's as if it sort of hasn't happened. So in other words, we have a foreign policy which doesn't include the second largest country in the world and our biggest trading partner. Now, all I'm saying is that our foreign policy should be made in the cabinet room in relation to these big tectonic shifts. You can see this overnight with the Chinese and the Americans arguing about trade policy.
Well, the tariffs started, the war's going back up.
What would you prefer, if you're a rational person, wouldn't you prefer cabinet ministers in the Security Committee and Foreign Policy Committee of the Cabinet to be looking at these gigantic movements, or do we simply be listening to corridor chit-chat in university dormitories about who said what and what made it into the Chinese media?
We'll come to tariffs and trade wars in a moment. Should the Labor Party, if indeed they win on Saturday, should they dismantle Peter Dutton's mega Department of Border Force and Home Security?
I think that's a matter for administrative judgment. But look, I tell you this, it's worth saying this. I think, look, I joined the Australian Parliament 50 years ago this year. In those 50 years, I've never seen any public figure as mean or mean-spirited as Peter Dutton. And at this election, those electors in Dixon have a chance to drive a political stake through his dark political heart.
Isn't he just doing what
I hope they do.
It's what the government he's a member of. He's a minister, he's given a job, and he goes out and does it, as Scott Morrison did as his predecessor.
Yeah, look, the thing is, the meanness which informs his view of the world and the country means that with this big apparatus at his hand, you would not know where his priorities are. Let's go back to basics. We live in the Asia Pacific. We've got a continent of our own and a border with nobody. The great power here is China, which is going to have influences all the way through, and we have our traditional relationship with our security partner, the United States. A clever country has a foreign policy which deals with both influences.
Would you unban Huawei from the 5G network?
Oh, I don't think. I think the government's made the right decision about Huawei, actually.
That's at the core of much of China's fury.
Yeah, well, look, if you want state-owned enterprises or state-controlled enterprises, and you want those to be part of the communication apparatus of another country, I think it's completely legitimate for the other country to say, hang on here, who are we serving? I don't know enough technical information about Huawei. But
none of us do. That's part of the problem.
My instinct would be to not have them in our security, in our communication apparatus.
We talk about reform. You've talked about economic reform, but what about parliamentary system reform? What about locked-in fixed terms? 4-year terms are often referred to. What about reforming the donation system? What about reforming some of the machinery of government, not just the policies?
Yeah, those things are good. But
no one talks about
what's been
them.
happening in Australia, John?
There's a great impatience.
There have been no great political ideas really in Australia for a quarter of a century. Bob Hawke and I removed the sort of closeted, protected economy and opened it up to the world, and look at the increases in wealth. When there are no big ideas out there, the Twitter sphere takes over.
The Labor Party don't seem to have many more of them than the Liberal Party.
I know. Look, Shorten has taken the biggest program, a defined program, in terms of. You can just let me go down some of the
changing the tax system, but it's just a different version of changing the tax system.
Let me go through them. TAFE and universities, $10 billion. New jobs tax cut and investment guarantee, $15 billion.
But these are the things governments do, aren't they?
But hang on, Medicare cancer package. Preschool support for kids in special, cheaper childcare, $15.9 billion. These are big, and they're paid for by knocking off tax expenditures that shouldn't have been there in the first place.
No, the big reform would be to accept and acknowledge what everyone knows, which is the GST should be 15%, and that'd save everybody's income tax
Well, I don't think
problems.
everyone does know that. And the thing is, you see, what's so pernicious about increasing the GST is that for people on ordinary incomes, their income and savings are one and the same. Income and expenditure is one and the same. They spend all of their income.
Yep.
So therefore they get belted 15. But if you're a strong earner and a big earner and you save most of your income, of course you don't pay the GST. And that's why the GST is regressive. At 10%, fine, it's a change to the tax mix, but at 15 you start to have these very, very, very important effects on the low paid.
But the people who spend the most pay the most tax, and people who earn high incomes spend on more things, so they contribute more GST.
Yeah, but they also save. That's why they're well and truly well invested in the stock market, they're well invested in property, and they're well invested in other things. I mean, the GST is not levied on property. So the GST is not the answer. What we need is, this is what the Labor Party is doing in the biggest shift really in 25 or 30 years. They're saying let's have a fairer, more efficient country where we improve these public services. And where there's a whole sense of inclusion by people in the community, that the government of the day works for them and you belong to them.
A couple of things that are just circulating right now. The first home buyers deposit assistance proposal that Scott Morrison announced. Josh Frydenberg has conceded in several interviews since there was no economic modelling done on it, but the ALP immediately matched it. It's pretty clear that there's been no modelling done by anyone, but they've just said this is a good idea, we're going to do it.
Let me repeat myself in this sense. The government is going to an election celebrating the fact they have no policy. They have no framework.
Well, there's a policy to help first home buyers.
So what happens right at the death, at the policy launch, they said, Scott, you better get something out there. We've got no policy and you've made a virtue of it. We've got you as the boy next door in the barbecue. You better say something. So what they've done, they've turned up this thing about the 5% deposit.
Look, for 10,000 out of 100,000 first home buyers.
Yeah, the biggest problem with all of these things is that the risk is that people get the 5%, in a momentarily it helps them, but the prices rise by more than 5% on the supply side. So
the market factors it in.
Yeah, in other words, it's very hard to do things on the demand side, in other words, with your extra money, your 5%, where the supply side doesn't increase the prices by 5%. So, this again is a sort of
So why did the Labor Party rush to adopt it?
A nervous reaction by the Prime Minister, who's finally woken up. Ding, 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 ding.
Why did the Labor Party rush to adopt it?
We don't have a policy. Maybe they don't like the baseball cap. Maybe they don't want me to do their barbecue next door. I better have a policy. A
couple of other quick things. Clive Palmer's gone to Fiji.
I wish he'd stay there.
Couldn't
he buy a hotel there and then bury himself underneath it?
He's spending Lord knows how much, tens of millions of dollars on full-page ads to buy a position in the Senate.
Yeah, it's obscene. Yeah.
Why? If a wealthy individual wants to spend money...
he can do it. He's perfect right. But, but you would think at least there'd be some modicum of conscientiousness. You wouldn't take yourself off to Fiji, you wouldn't think, would you?
Well, he claims that he's there for deeply personal reasons. He claims he has a friend who's terminally ill and he's made a flying visit. In fact, I think his quip was, when you've got a private jet, you can do things like this.
Well, probably you can.
But when you're prosecuting a federal election campaign and claiming to be a serious contender for the balance of power?
Yeah, well, he has no policy other than preference for people who are wealthy. That's where... This is the guy who voted with Joe Hockey to knock superannuation off at 9.5%, 9.5. People were going to 12%. This year, every Australian person in employment would be at 12% super, bar for the fact that Clive Palmer and Joe Hockey, Palmer got his vote in the Senate to vote with Hockey to jam it at 9.5. That when John Howard knocked off the 12% that I had legislated in 1995, and then Hockey knocked off the 12% which Wayne Swan and Kevin Rudd had legislated, that cost the average superannuant $100,000 as an accumulation.
Yep, over their lifetime of work.
Since 2001. From 2001 to now, the Liberal Party knocking off the 12% cost the average wage earner $100,000 in accumulation. So if someone's got an accumulation now of $300,000, it would be $400,000. I mean, they're dogs, these people, really.
How difficult was it for you?
Chase hubcaps and have Pal for breakfast. They're DOGS.
How difficult was it for you and Bob Hawke to sit down and reconcile?
Oh, look, I've been seeing Bob for years. I was at his 80th birthday. I've been over to his home over the years, and more recently, I was there 3 times last year. We're just going over old times, and everyone, I think, appreciates now that it was difficult to see at the time, but our creation remade Australia and remade the wealth of the country, And when I became Treasurer, I can't be sure about this number, but I think the All Ordinaries Index was about 450, and when I left it was about 2,300. In other words, it went up by 4 times the wealth in the stock markets. And it's only really gone up 1 time since, or maybe 2 times since. So... this enormous increase in... And the other thing, a 70% increase in real wages since 1991. I mean, Australian real wages are not growing, but the level is still very high. And it's very high as a consequence of those policies that Bob and I put into place. So,
and speaking of reconciliations, is the rumour true that it was Paul Keating that persuaded Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd to come and be at the Labor launch together?
No, I didn't have. I've not said a word to either one of them for a year or 2.
And what was it like behind the scenes as you were getting ready?
Good. No, that was all. It was very cheerful. I think, the Labor Party it's a sort of party of the ordinary people. It's it's always uplifting to be at a Labor Party turnout because the show means well. I mean, occasionally it's rickety but it means well and it's up-spirited. So turning up to a Labor launch is always a great charge.
But a massive proportion of Australians no longer want to vote for either of the major parties. In fact, the next parliament could well be a parliament that's dominated by independents in both the House and the Senate.
Yeah. This is what happens when governments fail to have a program, fail to have imagination, fail to have a vista, a panorama of where the country is going, and particularly when you see internecine sign battles like the ones between Turnbull and Abbott, and then then Morrison replacing Turnbull. People get switched off by the internecine battles the ideological confusion, the lack of clarity in policy, and of course they drift to the minor parties. I mean, you can see it.
We certainly can, but we'll see what happens on Saturday. Are you confident of a Labor win just finally?
Where I was the best position on the field is one out and one back. So you dart a bit like Winks. You sort of run up to the end. I think Bill Shorten will be the Winks of this election.
Well, we'll see whether or not the bookies, the pollsters and Paul Keating are correct. It's been fascinating as always. Thank you for your time and thank you for getting in touch. Former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, who was in Melbourne for private events over the weekend and got in touch and said, I want to make a contribution, which he has made this morning.